Colonel Wei Xiaogang stood in his London hotel room, staring at his reflection in the full-length mirror. His dark green military uniform fitted perfectly on his 52-year-old frame. 25 years of service in the People's Liberation Army had led to this moment. He touched each medal on his chest, remembering the battles and operations that earned them. The morning light came through the tall windows, making the gold buttons shine like small suns. This was the day he had dreamed about since joining the army as a young man from a small village in Shandong province. Today, he would attend his first official event as the new military attaché to the Chinese embassy in London. His father's voice echoed in his mind as he adjusted his collar. The old man had been a factory worker who never owned anything more valuable than his bicycle. But he had wisdom. Power comes to those who demand it, son. Never wait for others to give you respect. Take it. Those words had guided Wei through military academy, through his rise in the ranks, through every challenge. The hotel room was elegant with thick carpets and heavy curtains, very different from the simple barracks where he spent most of his career. Wei walked to the window and looked out at the London streets below. Black taxis and red buses moved like ants in organized lines. Everything here seemed to follow ancient rules and patterns. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Lieutenant Chen, his young aide, entered and saluted sharply. "Colonel, the embassy car is waiting. We should leave for the British Embassy in 10 minutes. The reception begins at 11. Wei nodded and turned back to the mirror. He had spent weeks preparing for this assignment, reading British military history, studying their customs, memorizing the ranks and traditions. The British loved their traditions more than any other nation. They clung to ceremonies that were centuries old. He thought about the Queen's Guard he had seen at Buckingham Palace during his tourist visit last year. Soldiers in bright red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats standing like statues. Tourists took pictures beside them, trying to make them laugh or move, but they never did. Wei respected that discipline. It reminded him of the guards at the Forbidden City in Beijing. "Colonel, we really should go," Chen said nervously, checking his watch. Wei picked up his military cap and placed it carefully on his head. The angle had to be perfect. In the military, every detail mattered. How you wore your uniform, how you walked, how you spoke. All of it sent messages about power and authority. The elevator ride down was silent. Wei reviewed mentally what he knew about today's event. Military attachés from 40 countries would attend. British generals and defense officials would be there. The American military attaché would certainly try to dominate conversations. The Russians would watch everyone while pretending not to care. This was not just a social gathering. It was a battlefield of different kind. Every word, every gesture would be analyzed. China's growing power made other nations nervous. They watched for signs of weakness or aggression. Wei would show them strength, confidence, and authority. The black embassy car waited outside. The driver, another young Chinese soldier, jumped out to open the door. Wei settled into the leather seats as Chen sat beside him. The car pulled into London traffic, heading toward the British Embassy in Belgravia. Wei watched the city pass by. Grand old buildings mixed with modern glass towers. History and progress side by side. Like China itself, he thought. Ancient civilization embracing the future. But first one had to master the present. And that meant understanding power. Today would be perfect. He would make important connections, demonstrate China's position, earn respect from these Western officers. His father would be proud. The boy from the village had become a colonel in one of the world's most powerful militaries. The car turned onto a tree-lined street. The British Embassy appeared ahead, its classical facade impressive even to Wei's practiced eye. The driver slowed as they approached the security gates. Wei straightened his uniform one last time. He was ready. Or so he thought. The British Embassy ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, sending sparkles of light across the room. The walls were covered in silk wallpaper with portraits of British military heroes watching over the gathering. Round tables with white tablecloths held silver trays of champagne glasses and small foods Wei did not recognize. He stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the scene. The room buzzed with conversations in many languages: English, French, Russian, Arabic, and others mixed together like an international symphony. Military uniforms from dozens of nations created a rainbow of colors: navy blues, army greens, Air Force grays, and the distinctive red of British officers. Lieutenant Chen stayed close behind as Wei entered the room. A waiter in a black uniform appeared immediately, offering champagne from a silver tray. Wei took a glass but did not drink. He needed his mind sharp today. The crowd was already thick with important people. Wei recognized several faces from the briefing materials he had studied. There was General Sir James Worthington, tall and gray-haired with medals covering his chest. The American Defense Attaché, Colonel Bradley Stevens, stood near the buffet table laughing loudly at something. The Russian representative, Major General Petrov, surveyed the room with cold eyes. Wei moved through the crowd slowly. He nodded politely when others looked his way, but did not rush to join conversations. Let them come to me, he thought. China does not chase anyone. Soon enough his strategy worked. A French Air Force colonel approached, introducing himself in accented English. Then a German naval captain. An Italian general. They all wanted to meet the new Chinese military attaché. They asked careful questions about his background, about China's military modernization, about trade relationships. Wei answered with practiced diplomacy. He revealed nothing important, but made each person feel heard. This was the dance of international relations, everyone gathering information while pretending to make small talk. Near the main entrance, Wei noticed something interesting. A Queen's Guard stood at attention in full ceremonial uniform. The bright red tunic, the white belt, the tall bearskin cap. The guard held his rifle at the perfect angle, his face completely expressionless. Wei had seen these guards before at tourist sites, but never inside a diplomatic event. The guard fascinated him. Such perfect stillness, such discipline. In China, soldiers showed similar dedication, but this was different. The British Guard seemed to exist in his own world, untouched by the activity around him. Diplomats walked past carrying drinks and plates of food. The guard never moved, never blinked. Wei continued circulating, meeting more military officers. A Japanese admiral discussed naval cooperation. A Canadian brigadier general talked about joint training exercises. Everyone was polite, professional, but Wei sensed something underneath. They were measuring him, testing the new Chinese representative. He noticed how conversations shifted when he approached certain groups. The Americans and British would lower their voices. The Europeans would change topics to safer subjects like weather or London traffic. They respected China's power but did not trust it. Not yet. An hour passed. Wei had met perhaps 30 officers from 20 countries. His champagne glass remained untouched. Chen had filled a small notebook with names and titles for later reference. The reception was going exactly as planned. That was when Wei noticed the positioning of key people in the room. The British ambassador, Sir Michael Hayes, stood near the fireplace, surrounded by Commonwealth military leaders. The American group had claimed the area near the tall windows. The Russians held court near the bar. And there in the center of it all stood the motionless Queen's Guard. An idea began forming in Wei's mind. The Guard represented British tradition, British authority. What would happen if a Chinese colonel approached him? What message would it send to this room full of military power brokers? Wei touched his medals again, feeling their weight. His father's words returned. Power comes to those who demand it. He looked at the Guard again, studying the perfect uniform, the rigid posture. Yes, he thought. This could be an opportunity. He began moving toward the Guard. Colonel Wei waited and watched like a hunter stalking prey. The moment had to be perfect. He stood near a marble pillar, sipping water from a crystal glass, while his eyes tracked the movements of important people in the room. The British ambassador had moved away from the fireplace and was now speaking with the French defense minister near the grand piano. The American group had spread out with Colonel Stevens, talking to the Australian Air Force chief. The Russian General Petrov remained at the bar, but Wei noticed his aide had started circulating through the room. Lieutenant Chen appeared at Wei's elbow. Colonel, the Japanese admiral wishes to continue your conversation about maritime cooperation when you have time. Wei nodded but kept his focus on the Queen's Guard. Later, Chen. Tell the admiral I will find him after I attend to something important. The guard had not moved a single muscle in over an hour. Not when a waiter nearly bumped into him with a tray. Not when two Italian officers had a loud disagreement just meters away. Not when a British child at the reception had walked up and stared at him for 5 full minutes before his mother pulled him away. Such discipline impressed Wei deeply, but it also presented a challenge. In China, military hierarchy was absolute. A soldier saluted a sergeant saluted a lieutenant. Everyone saluted the colonel. It was the natural order that kept armies functioning. Wei straightened his uniform, pulling down the green jacket until every line was perfect. He touched each medal briefly like a ritual. The Golden Star for bravery in the Taiwan Strait exercises, the Red Banner for excellence in military education, the Liberation Medal 3rd class for 20 years of distinguished service. He began walking. Slowly, deliberately. The crowd seemed to sense something important was happening. Conversations near Wei's path grew quieter. A British protocol officer paused mid-sentence to watch the Chinese colonel approach the ceremonial guard. Chen followed 3 steps behind, clearly uncomfortable. The young lieutenant had only been Wei's aide for 6 months. He still had much to learn about projecting power and authority in international settings. As Wei moved closer to the guard, he noticed more details. The man's eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above the embassy entrance. The famous 1,000-yard stare Wei had heard British veterans describe. The rifle gleamed with polish, not a single fingerprint on the metal. The bearskin cap sat at precisely the regulation angle. We stopped 4 meters away, close enough to be clearly in the guard's field of vision, but far enough to maintain military courtesy. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting his presence be felt. The room's energy shifted. Wei could feel eyes turning toward him. The Japanese admiral had stopped talking. 2 German officers lowered their champagne glasses. Even the busy waiters seemed to slow their movements. Wei took another step forward. Now 3 meters away. The guard remained frozen, but Wei thought he detected the slightest tension in the man's jaw. Or perhaps it was imagination. These guards were famous for their stillness. Tourists tried everything to make them react. Jokes, faces, even inappropriate touching, which earned swift removal by police. But Wei was not a tourist. He was a colonel in the People's Liberation Army, representing the world's most populous nation. Surely that carried different weight. Surely that demanded acknowledgement. He cleared his throat. Not loudly, but enough to be heard. The guard did not react. Wei felt heat rising in his chest. In Beijing, no soldier would dare ignore a colonel's presence. It would mean immediate punishment, possibly demotion or worse. 2 more steps. Now Wei stood directly in front of the guard, barely a meter away. He could see the individual threads in the red wool tunic, could count the brass buttons, could smell the gun oil on the rifle. Around them, the reception had developed a quiet center. Diplomats pretended to continue conversations, but their attention was clearly on the developing scene. Wei heard someone whisper in French. Another voice responded in German. He did not need translation. They were wondering what the Chinese colonel would do next. Wei squared his shoulders. The moment had arrived. Time to assert authority. Guardsman, Wei said clearly in his best English. His voice carried the authority of 25 years of military command. The soldier remained absolutely still, as if Wei had not spoken at all. The colonel felt his jaw tighten with the first stirring of real anger. Wei took a breath and stepped even closer, now just half a meter from the guard. He could see every detail of the man's face. Young, perhaps 25 years old. Clean-shaven with sharp features and gray eyes that stared at nothing. A small scar on the left eyebrow, probably from training or combat. I am Colonel Wei Xiaoging of the People's Liberation Army, Wei announced louder this time. Several nearby conversations stopped completely. A Turkish diplomat lowered his coffee cup. The Belgian defense attaché turned to watch openly. The guard's eyes remained fixed on the distant point. Not even a flicker of recognition. Wei felt heat rising in his face. This was becoming embarrassing. He had committed himself to this confrontation, and backing down now would mean losing face before the international community. "You will render proper military courtesy to a superior officer," Wei commanded. His voice had the sharp edge that made Chinese recruits jump to attention. He had used this tone thousands of times in his career. It had never failed to produce results. But the Queen's Guard stood like a statue carved from stone. The rifle remained at the perfect ceremonial angle. The bearskin cap did not move a millimeter. Even the guard's breathing seemed mechanical and regular, like a machine. Lieutenant Chen shifted nervously behind Wei. The young officer could sense the growing tension. Around them, the circle of watching diplomats had grown larger. Wei spotted the American Colonel Stevens smirking near the windows. The Russian General Petrov had left the bar and moved closer for a better view. This silence was intolerable. Wei raised his voice another level. "I order you to salute." The command rang across the nearby section of the ballroom. More heads turned. The British ambassador Sir Michael Hayes looked over from his conversation with the Canadian general. His expression showed mild concern, but also something else. Amusement, perhaps. The guard remained frozen in position. Wei felt sweat forming under his uniform collar despite the cool air conditioning. His careful plan to demonstrate Chinese authority was becoming a public humiliation. He had to escalate or retreat, and retreat was not an option. "Guardsmen, you will acknowledge my rank immediately," Wei barked. "This is a direct order from a superior officer." His military bearing was fully engaged, now shoulders back, chest out, the posture of command that had served him through decades of service. Still nothing. The guard might have been a mannequin in a military museum. We noticed the man did not even seem to be sweating despite the heavy wool uniform and the warm room. Such physical control was impressive, but also infuriating. A whisper ran through the watching crowd. Wei caught fragments in different languages. The Chinese colonel. The Queen's Guard. This should be interesting. Someone suppressed a laugh, quickly turning it into a cough. Wei's face burned now. He stepped so close that his nose was just centimeters from the guard's face. "Are you deaf, soldier?" he demanded. His breath should have been felt on the guard's cheek, but the man showed no reaction at all. "I am a colonel in the People's Liberation Army, and I demand proper military protocol." Wei was almost shouting now. The entire reception had become aware of the confrontation. Conversations throughout the ballroom died as word spread quickly through the diplomatic crowd. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses stopped in his tracks. The string quartet in the corner let their music fade to silence. Even the kitchen staff peered through the service doors to see what was causing the disturbance. But the Queen's Guard remained perfectly still. His 1,000-yard stare never wavered. His breathing never changed. He existed in a bubble of absolute discipline that Wei could not penetrate. The colonel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was beyond disrespect. It was a deliberate insult to China itself, to him personally, to everything he represented in this room full of international power brokers. The heat in Colonel Wei's face spread down his neck and into his chest. He had never felt such public disrespect in his entire military career. In China, when a colonel spoke, soldiers jumped. When he commanded, they obeyed. This British Guard's refusal to even acknowledge his existence was like a slap across the face. Wei's breathing became heavy. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The watching crowd had formed a complete circle, now maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly fascinated by what they were seeing. The confrontation had become the main event of the reception, more interesting than any diplomatic conversation. The colonel's mind raced through options. He could not back down. Too many important people were watching. The story would spread through embassies within hours. Beijing would hear about it. His superiors would demand explanations. How could he explain that a simple British soldier had ignored direct orders from a Chinese colonel? In desperation, Wei switched tactics. Perhaps the guard did not understand English well enough. Many British soldiers came from working-class backgrounds with limited education. Wei began speaking in Mandarin, his voice loud and commanding. "Stand at attention, soldier. Render proper military honors. I am your superior officer." The Chinese words rang across the ballroom. Most of the diplomats did not understand, but they recognized the tone of military command. The guard remained perfectly still. His gray eyes stayed fixed on the invisible point above the embassy entrance. Wei felt rage building in his chest, like a furnace. He switched to French, thinking perhaps the guard had European training. "Soldier, you will salute immediately. This is a direct order." Still nothing. The guard's face remained completely expressionless, as if Wei was speaking to empty air. We tried Russian next. He had learned it during joint military exercises years ago. "Comrade guardsman, acknowledge my rank according to military protocol." The harsh Slavic words produced no better result than Chinese or French. The watching crowd had grown to include almost everyone at the reception. The American defense attaché, Colonel Stevens, was no longer hiding his grin. He whispered something to a British naval captain who struggled not to laugh. The Russian General Petrov watched with undisguised amusement, his cold eyes showing rare emotion. Lieutenant Chen tugged gently at Wei's uniform sleeve. "Colonel, perhaps we should." Wei shook him off angrily, barely controlling his temper. The young aide stepped back, quickly recognizing the danger signs. He had seen the colonel angry before, but never like this. Wei's entire concept of military authority was under assault. In his world, rank meant everything. A colonel's word was law. Soldiers existed to follow orders from superior officers. This guard's absolute refusal to acknowledge him struck at the foundation of everything Wei believed about military service. He leaned in close enough to smell the guard's aftershave. "Listen to me carefully, soldier. I have commanded thousands of men in combat. I have served my nation for 25 years. I have earned these medals through blood and sacrifice. You will show proper respect." The guard's eyes never moved. His breathing remained steady and measured. He might have been alone in an empty field rather than the center of an international incident. Wei felt his control slipping. His voice rose to parade ground volume. "I am Colonel Wei Xiaogang of the People's Liberation Army of China. You are a guardsman in the British Army. Military law demands that you acknowledge a superior officer." His face was now bright red with anger and embarrassment. A British protocol officer had begun moving through the crowd. Wei saw him from the corner of his eye, a thin man in a dark suit with a worried expression. The Japanese admiral looked uncomfortable. Several European diplomats shook their heads disapprovingly. But others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. The Americans were clearly entertained. The Russians showed open amusement. Even some British officers watched with barely hidden smiles. They knew something Wei did not understand. The confrontation had become the reception's main entertainment. Throughout the grand ballroom, conversations died completely as words spread from group to group. "The Chinese colonel is having a row with the Queen's Guard," someone whispered in perfectly polished British accent. Diplomats abandoned their small talk about trade agreements and military cooperation. They moved closer to the scene, trying to appear casual while positioning themselves for the best view. The Italian defense minister nearly spilled his wine in his hurry to join the growing circle of spectators. We could feel hundreds of eyes on him now. The weight of their attention pressed down like a physical force. Sweat ran down his back under the heavy uniform. His throat felt dry despite the champagne he had refused earlier. The guard stood before him unchanging and unmovable, like the Tower of London itself. The colonel knew he was trapped. Backing down would mean complete humiliation before the international defense community. But continuing this futile confrontation was making things worse with each passing second. His reputation as a serious military professional was crumbling before his eyes. He switched back to English, raising his voice even louder. "This is unacceptable, guardsmen. You are disrespecting not just me, but the People's Republic of China." His words echoed off the ballroom's high ceiling. "I represent 1.4 billion Chinese citizens, and you dare to ignore me." The guard's 1,000-yard stare never wavered. His rifle remained at the perfect ceremonial angle. Even his breathing seemed to mock Wei with its mechanical regularity. The colonel felt something close to panic rising in his chest. In 25 years of military service, he had never encountered such complete defiance. Lieutenant Chen pulled at Wei's sleeve again, more urgently this time. "Colonel, we should withdraw. This is becoming." Wei spun around to face his aide, fury in his eyes. "Be silent, Chen. Return to your position immediately." The young officer backed away quickly, fear replacing concern on his face. The American Colonel Stevens was now openly chuckling. He said something to a British brigadier, who covered his mouth to hide a smile. The Russian General Petrov had moved to the front of the crowd, his usual stone face showing clear amusement at Wei's predicament. Near the main entrance, Wei spotted the elderly British General Sir James Worthington. The decorated officer was walking purposefully through the crowd, his expression serious but not unkind. Behind him, the protocol officer looked relieved that someone with authority was taking charge. Wei made one last desperate attempt. He pulled out his military identification and held it inches from the guard's face. "Look at this soldier. Colonel Xiaogang, People's Liberation Army. You see the rank insignia. You see the official seal. You must acknowledge my authority." The guard's gray eyes remained fixed on their distant point. His face showed no more emotion than a photograph. Wei's hand holding the identification began to shake slightly from rage and embarrassment. This was beyond anything he had imagined possible. The crowd pressed closer. Wei heard cameras clicking as some diplomats recorded the scene on their phones. By tomorrow, the video would be in intelligence agencies across the world. By next week, it would probably be on social media. The loss of face was becoming catastrophic. A waiter dropped a tray somewhere in the back of the room. The crash of breaking glass made several people jump, but the Queen's Guard remained absolutely still. We noticed the young soldier had not even blinked during the entire confrontation. Such discipline should have earned respect, but now it only fueled the colonel's anger. "This is intolerable," Wei shouted in English, then Mandarin, then French again. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. The sophisticated military officer was disappearing, replaced by a man facing complete public humiliation. His father's words about demanding power seemed hollow now, mocking him from the past. General Worthington had almost reached them. Wei saw him clearly now, the lined face and knowing eyes of a career soldier who had seen every type of military situation. The crowd parted respectfully as the British general approached the center of the diplomatic storm. "Colonel Wei," the voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. General Sir James Worthington stood beside them now, his presence immediately commanding attention. The elderly British officer carried himself with the natural authority that came from decades of military service. Wei turned to face him, grateful for any escape from his predicament, but still burning with anger and shame. "General," he said stiffly, attempting to salvage some dignity, "this guard refuses to show proper military courtesy. It is a deliberate insult to my rank and nation." Sir James positioned himself carefully between Wei and the motionless guardsman. His weathered face remained diplomatically neutral, but Wei caught something in his eyes. Not mockery like the Americans, not amusement like the Russians, something closer to understanding mixed with firm resolve. "Ah yes, the Queen's Guard," Sir James said calmly. His voice carried enough for the surrounding diplomats to hear clearly. "Perhaps you are not familiar with their particular protocols, Colonel Wei." The British general's tone was polite, but held an undertone of steel. Wei's eyes narrowed defensively. "Military courtesy is universal, General. A soldier salutes a superior officer regardless of nationality. This is basic protocol understood by every professional army in the world." He gestured angrily at the guard. "This man's behavior is unacceptable." "Indeed," Sir James replied. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Wei's agitation. "Military courtesy is important. However, the Queen's Guard operates under very specific orders that override normal protocols." He paused, letting the words sink in. Wei felt the first flutter of uncertainty. "What do you mean, specific orders?" "A soldier's first duty is to respect the chain of command. In China, this guardsman's behavior would result in severe punishment. The British general's expression softened slightly. "You must understand, Colonel, that the Queen's Guard has served the Crown directly for over 350 years. When on ceremonial duty, they acknowledge no one. Not foreign officers. Not British generals." He paused meaningfully. "Not even members of the royal family except Her Majesty herself." The words hit Wei like cold water in the face. "But that is impossible," he stammered. His carefully constructed worldview of military hierarchy was crumbling. Military rank demands respect. A colonel outranks a guardsman in any army. Sir James continued patiently. "During ceremonial duty, these guards are not part of the regular military chain of command. They have maintained this tradition through wars, revolutions, and countless attempts to make them break protocol." His voice carried the weight of centuries. "They do not salute. They do not speak. They do not move." Wei felt the blood draining from his face. Around them, the crowd of diplomats watched intently. The American colonel's grin had evolved into something more respectful. The Russian general nodded slowly, as if confirming what he already knew. "Not for presidents," Sir James continued. "Not for prime ministers. Certainly not for foreign military officers, regardless of rank or nation. The tradition is absolute. It has survived 3.5 centuries without exception." The full magnitude of Wei's error crashed over him like a wave. He had just made a spectacular fool of himself before the entire international diplomatic community. Worse, he had revealed complete ignorance of British military tradition while trying to assert Chinese superiority. The guardsmen continued to stare straight ahead, as if the entire confrontation had been a passing breeze. We now understood that the young soldier had not been showing disrespect. He had been following orders that transcended ordinary military protocol. Orders that had been in place since before Wei's ancestors had dreamed of modern China. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Wei stood frozen, his mind racing through the implications. The story would travel through diplomatic channels within hours. Beijing would receive reports. His superiors would demand explanations. How could he explain that he had challenged centuries of British tradition out of ignorance and arrogance? But Sir James was not finished. "These men are not ordinary soldiers, Colonel. They are selected from elite regiments. They undergo special training to maintain absolute stillness regardless of provocation. They have stood watch through bombing raids, terrorist threats, and countless tourists trying to make them react." Wei's humiliation was complete. He had treated this elite guardian like a common recruit, had shouted at him in multiple languages, had waved his identification in his face like a petty bureaucrat. The loss of face was devastating. The full weight of his mistake crushed down on Colonel Wei like a mountain. He stood there in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the international defense community, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The proud officer who had entered the embassy just hours ago was gone, replaced by a man facing complete professional humiliation. Around him, the watching diplomats began to murmur among themselves. Wei caught fragments of conversation in multiple languages. Typical Chinese arrogance. Did not do his homework. What did he expect? The words stung worse than any physical blow. The guardsman remained at his post, unchanged and unmoved. We now saw him differently. Not as a stubborn soldier refusing orders, but as a keeper of traditions older than modern China itself. The young man's discipline was not defiance but duty to something greater than military rank. General Sir James watched Wei carefully. The British officer's expression held no mockery, but Wei could read the message clearly. This was what happened when one assumed their own customs applied everywhere, when arrogance replaced preparation, when demanding respect replaced earning it. But military hierarchy, Wei's voice trailed off weakly. His arguments sounded hollow even to himself now. The solid foundation of rank and authority he had built his career on seemed suddenly unstable. Sir James spoke again, his tone still patient but firm. "Every nation has its sacred traditions, Colonel. In China, you have the Forbidden City Guards. In Russia, they have the Kremlin Regiment. In America, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier." He gestured toward the motionless guardsman. "This is ours." Wei felt his face burning with shame. The comparison made his error even more glaring. He would never expect foreign officers to command the guards at Tiananmen Square. Why had he assumed British traditions would bend to his authority? They have stood watch through the London Blitz, Sir James continued. Through terrorist attacks. Through protests and riots. Not once in 350 years has a Queen's Guard broken protocol while on ceremonial duty. Not once. The historical weight of those words settled over Wei like a burial shroud. He had challenged something that had survived world wars and empire collapse. His temporary rank and recent power seemed insignificant compared to such endurance. Lieutenant Chen had crept closer again, concern overcoming fear. The young aide looked stricken, watching his superior officer's public downfall. Around them, the crowd waited to see what would happen next. The American officers no longer smiled. Even the Russians watched with something approaching sympathy. Wei's mind raced through possible responses. He could storm out angrily, but that would confirm every stereotype about Chinese military arrogance. He could continue arguing, but Sir James had destroyed his position completely. He could pretend nothing had happened, but the entire room had witnessed his humiliation. The protocol officer hovered nearby, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. But Wei suddenly felt all the anger drain from his body, replaced by something else. Understanding, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion from the weight of his mistake. He looked at the guardsman again. Really looked this time. The young soldier was probably the same age as Lieutenant Chen, following orders, doing his duty, maintaining traditions that meant more than any individual officer's pride. Wei had spent his career demanding respect through rank. This guard earned it through discipline. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Diplomats began shifting nervously, wondering if the Chinese colonel would explode in rage or retreat in shame. The tension in the room was like a held breath waiting for release. Wei straightened his uniform one more time. His medals still gleamed on his chest, but they felt heavier now. Less like achievements and more like reminders of how much he still had to learn about the wider world beyond China's borders. Sir James waited patiently. The British general had delivered his lesson, but seemed prepared to allow Wei to choose his response. It was a final gesture of respect, despite the circumstances. A recognition that even in humiliation a military officer deserved the chance to recover with dignity. Wei took a deep breath. The next words he spoke would define not just this moment, but possibly his entire future career in international relations. The watching crowd leaned in slightly, anticipating either further confrontation or complete capitulation. The fate of the afternoon hung in the balance. The room held its breath. Colonel Wei stood at the crossroads of his professional life, with hundreds of eyes watching his next move. The proud Chinese officer who had stormed toward the Queen's Guard was gone. In his place stood a man facing a choice that would echo through diplomatic channels for years. Wei took a step back from the guardsman, then another. His body language shifted from confrontation to something else entirely. The watching diplomats noticed the change immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the waiters paused in their duties. General Sir James Wei said loudly enough for all to hear. His voice had lost its commanding edge, replaced by something more difficult for a career military officer. Humility. I apologize for my ignorance of your traditions. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. The American Colonel Stevens lowered his champagne glass. The Russian General Petrov raised an eyebrow, the first real emotion he had shown all day. This was not what anyone had expected from the proud Chinese officer. Wei turned toward the guardsman and did something that shocked even Sir James. He executed a slow, deliberate bow. Not a military gesture, but one of genuine respect. To the Queen's Guard, I offer my apologies for the disruption. I have dishonored your service through my ignorance. The ballroom fell completely silent. In Chinese culture, public admission of error meant tremendous loss of face. Yet Wei had chosen this path deliberately. He straightened from the bow and found Sir James extending his hand. We all have our traditions, Colonel, the British general said warmly. His entire demeanor had changed from stern teacher to gracious host. Perhaps you would allow me to explain more about our ceremonial protocols over brandy. I believe you will find them quite fascinating. Wei grasped the offered hand gratefully. "I would be honored, General. It seems I have much to learn about British customs." He managed a small smile. "Today has been educational, though perhaps not in the way I expected." A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The American colonel's mocking grin had transformed into something more respectful. Several European diplomats nodded approvingly. Even the Russians seemed impressed by Wei's ability to transform humiliation into dignity. As Wei shook Sir James's hand, he caught the slightest movement from the guardsman. Just a tiny shift in the eyes, so small others might have missed it. The gray eyes that had stared through him for so long flickered toward him for just an instant. It was the barest hint of acknowledgement. Soldier to soldier, a recognition of courage of a different kind. Lieutenant Chen appeared at Wei's elbow, relief evident on his young face. The aide had watched his superior's transformation from arrogance to humility with growing respect. This was leadership lessons could not teach. Sometimes the greatest strength came from admitting weakness. The crowd began to disperse. Conversations resumed, but with a different tone. The incident that could have been a diplomatic disaster had become something else. A moment of cultural understanding. A bridge between different traditions. A reminder that respect was earned, not demanded. Wei walked with Sir James toward a quiet corner of the ballroom. Behind them, the Queen's Guard continued his eternal watch. Unmoving, unmoved, as he had for centuries before this day and would for centuries after. The guardian of traditions that transcended rank, nationality, and time itself. As they walked, Sir James spoke quietly. "You showed real character just now, Colonel. Not many officers would have handled that situation with such grace." Wei felt some of his confidence returning. "Perhaps my father was wrong, General. Power does not come to those who demand it. It comes to those who understand it." The British general smiled. "Your father sounds like a wise man. But perhaps you are both right. Power takes many forms. Sometimes it wears medals and gives orders. Sometimes it stands silent in a red uniform following traditions older than memory." Wei glanced back at the guardsman one last time. The young soldier remained at his post, a testament to discipline and duty. The colonel touched his medals again, but this time they felt different. Not heavier, but somehow more meaningful. Reminders not just of past achievements, but of future learning. The diplomatic reception continued around them. Deals were discussed. Alliances were strengthened. Information was exchanged. But for Colonel Wei Xiaogang, the most important exchange had already occurred. He had traded arrogance for wisdom, demanded respect, and learned to earn it instead. And somewhere in London, the Queen's Guard maintained their eternal watch. Silent sentinels of tradition, unmoved by rank or power, faithful to duties that transcended the temporary concerns of politics and pride. As they had always been, as they would always be.